Good morning. Oh, is it on? Okay. My name's Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery. It's a Saturday morning, and our class today, well, this week we got a large shipment of plants in containers like these from Dave Wilson, who's our main supplier of edibles, woody edibles, let's put it that way. And every year, usually in early December, we bring in several thousand different kinds of edibles and containers. And this class today we'll be talking about how to grow some of the ones that we've gotten in: hops, kiwis, and grapes, the vining ones. The hops, now for most people, this is more of a novelty than a useful plant because hops, the seed pods are used to flavor beer, or the bracts that they create are used to flavor beer. But it's a quite an ornamental plant, and it's definitely a novel, and it makes a lot of shade for the summer months. It doesn't really give you much shade at all winter or spring, but in the summer months it creates a nice canopy. So this is an interesting plant. So hops, botanical name is humulus, or it might be US. They're from, or they were first grown a lot in Austria, Germany for beer making, but they don't need much winter. In fact, we've grown a lot of different hops over the years, and they all seem to do well locally without any chill, without much chill. I mean, in Florida, they're actually growing them in greenhouses. If you grow them in a greenhouse in Florida, there's not much cold air in there, and they're still growing them. So what these do is when the weather's cool, they will die down to the ground. So in the wintertime, you just get rid of whatever's on the trellis or whatever support you're using them on. You can grow them on the ground. They're kind of a mess on the ground. But there's not much left in the winter, just stubs of branches on the dirt. And every spring, they just take off, and they'll grow during the year about 10 to 15, even 20 feet from this, flower, make their bracts. You can harvest them. They can make several crops a year, at least locally here in Orange County. And then when it gets cool here in late November, early December, the entire top dies again. They're down to just what's left in the ground. So they're pretty easy. I mean, it's nice to have a support to make them look better. I mean, they can grow on the ground, but they'll cover a big area of your garden. So usually people put them on a patio cover, on a fence. You can make a structure, if you like, out of tall metal poles with a cross beam, and then hang string or wire down, and they'll climb up that also. So they're easy. Full sun is fine. They'll grow in a lot of shade. They'll produce a lot of their bracts either way. So 40 years ago, we didn't know that these would grow here, but one of our employees who does make beer grew them on our asphalt, um, pure asphalt in hot location. We're going, okay, no problems. It has no need, not much need for winter, so they're easy. You can grow them in a good sized container. 15 gallons probably not big enough to get a very big plant, but they'll still bloom in here. A better size would be a half barrel or in the ground. Now, hops are not very picky about soil quality, neither are grapes. Kiwis are more, uh, uh, they definitely are sensitive to compost around the roots. And most growers, unfortunately, grow these in compost. The soil that Dave Wilson uses is pretty good. I would say you wouldn't have to remove it, but if you feel like you want to and just not take a chance, you can, this time of year when they're basically dormant, you can wash the soil and put them in something better, either the native soil in the ground or in either one of our potting soils, no compost in them. top pot or the acid mix, either one will work. Most of these plants like it to be slightly acidic, or top pot or acid mix are both acidic. Or acid mix a little bit more acidic than the top pot, but it's not a huge number, so you can grow them either way. So the hops, basically not much to do. Hops do often get spider mites in the summer. So we will get out the oil sprays, such as this brand here, and just make a spray out of it and hit the leaves to get rid of spider mites. Just watch for that. That's about the only pest we've seen on them at all. Okay. Now kiwi, I haven't. Now kiwis are really botanical name Actinidia deliciosa. These are from China, not New Zealand. They were promoted in New Zealand, but they're actually from China, and they're grown a lot there. But New Zealand does more with them than anyone else does. California does quite a bit with kiwis too. Now, just so you know, we haven't been able to get a hold of the yellow or the golden kiwis. And these are the fuzzy kiwis, not the smooth, sometimes called kiwi berries, that are almost like grapes in size. We haven't really been enthralled with that, just because they sell the self-fertile female, which is not very self-fertile. It usually makes a dozen or so every year. It doesn't, not real impressive performer by itself. So we get the fuzzy kiwis. Now, the fuzzy kiwis, we are marginal here in climate. Some years you get a good crop, some years you may not. They like to be about 300 to 500 hours of chill. We're not sure exactly what. I haven't really grown these myself. They succeed in the lower spots of Orange County fairly well. If you live along a big riverbed or a real flat area of Orange County with no hills, you'll get more chill in those locations. If you're in a canyon, you'll get a good amount of chill there too. But if you're on a hilltop or on a plateau somewhere, some years you won't get much fruit at all on kiwis. And it does take them takes them several years to get productive. Officially, it's 4 to 5 years, but I have a relative who told me it took them 9 years, and they're up in a Canyonville Park to get a crop off of there. So they're not as reliable. Hops, you'll get the hops the first year. Grapes, usually the second year. Kiwis, it takes some time for them to develop some thicker stems. Now, kiwis, I can show you what they recommend, what they do in commercial farms, but in your own yard, it can be much different unless you want a lot of fruit. Again, we're not reliable here. There are no kiwi farms I know of in Orange County, and nothing much in San Diego County, although inland they can still do it. But most of the kiwi farms are in the Central Valley, where the Central Valley you get at least 600, 700 hours of chill, even 1,000 hours of chill in the winter. Here in Orange County, some years we get only 100 hours of chill. Earlier this year we had 400 hours, so we had almost 500 hours in fact, so we had enough chill this year. So kiwis, they do recommend on farms that you only allow one stem to grow to your upper support. So most kiwi farms, what they do is they'll have real thick posts, 4-inch to 6-inch posts going up 5 or 6 foot. And then a cross beam at the top. Like a 2 by 6 by, say, 10 foot long or so. And they'll have a wire going across the center, and then a wire going across like so. And then at the bottom of it, they'll have another wire down at the base of that, so you can have a kiwi vine come up. Now they say don't let it wrap around the post. They said it gets so thick. The stems on kiwis, grapes, same thing. Don't let them wrap around the post. They'll actually crush the wood, or they'll embed themselves in it. So they say let it, tie it up, let it go up one side, and then on the top, just tie it along the center wire. I didn't draw the final wire going across there. Um, and then you'll need, now on kiwis, you'll need both the female and the male. So on kiwis, they're called what's called dioecious. There's a separate male plant and a separate female plant. The female plant makes fruit, the male plant doesn't. But if you don't have the male, you're not going to get any fruit on the female. So you make sure you have both. The males are called, the we carry are called tomuri. And the females we have are called Vincent. There are other ones you can get that are fairly low chill, but I don't have access to them. So that usually it takes a year or so to get up to the top here. So you have this kiwi vine going up, and then we might have enough time you'll get some growth going out to the sides. You go usually both directions. And then the fruiting branches will come off the sides of these, of the center cordon kind of, then you get your canes coming out like this. And we usually have this wire attached to the top, and they have the last wire attached to the bottom, so they can kind of have their natural curve going downwards in the weight of the branch. So kiwis, like grapes, form on wood that's been around. That was, whatever wood grows this year can fruit and flower and fruit next year. So it's second-year wood, or wood that's at least 1 year old, that tends to make the flowers and the fruit. So what they tell you to do is you find the branches that have nice buds on them near their base, and during the winter you cut these back to a shorter section of that. I believe it's like 1 to 2 feet, and you see all these nice buds. And what will happen is the next year these buds will grow out, and they'll have flowers and kiwis hanging on them. Now they do say that the problem with kiwis is they have too much growth all over the place. And what will happen is they'll send out more branches that may not have any fruit on them. They'll send out new branches from the top of this vine that just shade all this stuff. And they'll tell you mid-year, be sure, now kiwis ripen in the fall, mid-year make sure you cut off anything that's overlaying all these side branches. Because if it shades it too much, these just kind of fail after a few years, and then you'll have to have new side branches. So they said, just clip off any branch that's threatening to cover this that's not fruiting, especially if it's not fruiting, because they'll make new branches all over. So a lot of their efforts in growing kiwis is to keep the fruiting stems uncovered so that they have access to sun. And then in the next winter, one of these branches that are closer to the base of the original branch you had, you can save that one and cut off all the rest, because all you need is one nice branch with, hopefully you'll see one with nice bud formation where the leaves were attached. They'll have some nice big buds there. It's similar to grapes, like if you're pruning a wine grape, where you keep shorter canes. So now you don't have to grow it the way they do it. So they do this because they have this acres and acres and acres to do, and it's easier. But you can grow them in containers. We've seen people grow them in large containers with stakes, hoop stakes, or just stakes going up, and they'll have the vines going up like this with little side branches on the sides that still fruit. So you don't have to make it this shape, but this is what the easiest for harvesting and all that. My relative just had them growing on their patio roof. Yes.
Question, do you put a male on one side and the female on the other, or what do you produce for next week?
Well, the literature says about males and females they have to be within 75 feet. I think it's a way closer than that. So I would put them on opposite ends if you have a set like this. But if you have them in a big pot, you'll have to put both of them near each other. Now the males are pruned differently. So the females, the fruit takes all year to develop. So you have to leave this structure here all year. Let's put a male up here on this side, say. And generally in the wintertime, you don't prune the males much. You can prune them in the summer to kind of get them smaller because you don't need that big a male plant to get all the flowers. But they'll make their side branches also. And generally you don't prune them because they'll bloom along their entire length of branch, or you don't prune them as much. You want a lot of male flowers on there. And then once they bloom, you can cut them way back. So that's mid-spring they bloom. Trim them way back to the main stem, or you can even trim it down to here. Let them regrow on your structure that year because they're not there to make fruit. You just want them to regrow, and then they'll have good flowering wood again for the next year. So on the commercial ones, they'll have them growing on an adjacent wire, not right over the female, but they'll be close, and then they'll trim it back to short spurs after they bloom so they can regrow and make flower buds again in the same area. Same problem if they have lots of vertical growth that's covering up all the rest of it. You got to get rid of that during the summertime too. So lots of pruning on kiwis.
Are you using a second line foot, not the single line?
Well, commercially they have a second row going next to it of this same structure, or they'll have female, then male, then female. They'll do it that way too. I mean, you can intertwine them like this. You just have to keep track of which is which. Which is well, you can do it. I mean, if you only have one or two plants, it's not a big deal. But don't let the male shade out the female one. I mean, if it's not fruiting, it's probably going to be really vigorous. So on these, if you're doing it traditional, you'll have to cut off a lot of these branches. And they say be very careful with kiwi vines. Don't let if they start coiling like this, that's a weak spot. And so they'll tell you if you have a coil form on your plant, cut it back to where it's not coiled, let it regrow. They grow really fast when they're healthy. So just make sure it's a nice straight stem where you intend it to grow, because any coiling or bending around too much is a weak spot. They'll break easier at those places. So try to avoid that when they're growing. I mean, there's no rules here for your own yard. You can have more than one stem going up, but just be aware of, structurally they're stronger with one. And if they twirl like this one here is kind of curled, that's probably not good to keep. And do be aware within 10 years, these stems will be like that thick. So now kiwis, we haven't seen many pests on it. One of the unusual things about kiwis is that sometimes cats treat them like catnip. So you have to be careful with cats. They can, on a young plant, old plants they can't hurt, but young plants they can rub against them and mess up the branching. So be careful on that. Whenever we used to prune our kiwi plants and drop the leaves on the ground, the cats would roll them just like catnip. So, and keep track of which is male and which is female. A lot of our customers lose one of them, and then they don't know which one they have. Now, just so you know, they're fairly easy to tell from the flowers. So if you have the flowers are white petals. Generally, if you have a female flower, the stigma in the middle will be prominent. The anthers around the sides that hold the pollen are not developed very well. In a male flower, the anthers are more developed. The female part in the middle is not. So you'll have the anthers going around the sides in a male flower. Of course, that only helps when they're in bloom, so try to keep track. Some farms will paint the female trunks pink and the male trunks blue. So again, don't expect fruit for 4 or 5 years on kiwis. Do expect to do a lot of pruning to make it more productive. I don't think I left anything out. Kiwis, again, we haven't seen many pests. Snails, maybe. Watch for snails. Fertilizer and water, they do need ample of both. Hops don't seem to need as much help, but the kiwis, they're watered amply, which means keep the soil moist at least a foot deep. Water daily in the summer. And just a good fertilizer. Now, we do like in the long run the organic fertilizers like Dr. Earth or Down to Earth or any other organic brand. They're better than the chemicals in the long term. If you're in a pot, one of the thing about container growing is that it always needs to be fertilized because the fertilizers flush through. In that case, the time release like the Osmocote Plus will help you out. Otherwise, you'd be feeding them every month at least. So, Osmocote, this one lasts 6 months. You can do both. Okay, so you don't have to follow these rules on structure, but if you do have a structure like this now, one of the homeowners who's done this says that unless you anchor these, grapes, both grapes and kiwis get very heavy. If you just have a 4x4 post here and cross beams like this and wires in the middle, they'll start sagging toward the middle from the weight. So one homeowner says you put a 2x6, get a long 2x6 and just make a box structure. And then it can't collapse in. Or you can just make a box, just make lots of wood structures tend not to sag, but wire certainly can. Now this year, we didn't get as many kiwi vines as we'd like. We've only got a dozen of each, so don't hesitate if you want to try them. Again, they're not in the center of Orange County. They're not California. They're not super reliable like they are in inland areas of California or Northern California. So you're taking a bit of a chance, although they usually still leaf out. They just may not bloom as well if we don't have the cold. Now, grapes all grow and produce fruit in Orange County. The main thing about grapes you have to watch out for is a disease we get here because we're coastal called powdery mildew. Usually April through summer when it's warmer, the foliage and the stems and the fruit can get covered with that powdery mold. that'll destroy the fruit before it ripens. And generally, there are varieties of grapes that are real resistant. No grape is entirely immune to powdery mildew. This year was the worst mildew weather we've seen ever. I mean, 2013 was a bad year, but this year seemed to be worse than 2013. And just about every grape we have, even though we specialize in the mildew resistant varieties, every single grape we had mildew on it. So mildew, there are a lot of chemicals that are supposedly good controls for that. This year, what worked the best for us on powdery mildew, and it did keep them clean, we finally did it, was a combination of our oils, mineral oil and baking soda. This brand of mineral oil, All Seasons Oil by Bonide, there's different brands of really clean mineral oils that don't tend not to burn. We do in 1 gallon of water, I'll write better from this side. We will add 4 tablespoons of the oil. The range, they give you a range on here, 2 to 5 tablespoons per gallon of water for spraying on foliage. We go with the 4. We've always done it with 4. And we'll also add 1 tablespoon of baking soda. And put that in a nice sprayer. We use a backpack sprayer that can really give us a lot of pressure. Now, if you've got a real bad case of mildew, you might want to, before you spray this, just go through with a hose and just blast the mildew off. See if you can get it off there. And then after it dries, then spray the oil and baking soda on it. But that finally cleaned up the mildew on our grapes this year, is that combination. Works for roses, works for other plants too. They get the powdery mildew hydrangeas. We sprayed our hydrangeas with it. Some Gerbera daisies. So mildew seed. So vineyards, a lot of vineyards have iceberg roses planted nearby, because they said the roses tend to pick up the powdery mildew about a week or 2 before the grapes get it. So that's their sensor plant, like a canary in a cage in a mine. The roses will get the mildew before the grapes do. So once they see the roses get the mildew, they start spraying the grapes. So we specialize in carrying grapes that are mildew resistant. The grapes you see at the supermarket are primarily the famous ones, Thompson Seedless and Flame, the red ones. These are pure European grapes, and they get mildew really bad. We've kind of given up selling both of these quite a while ago when we started getting these more humid years. Thompson rarely succeeds in Orange County, and Flame, maybe 1 out of 3 years you'll get a decent crop. The more inland you go, if you're 10 miles from the ocean, you're better off than, say, 5 miles. And if you go in 20 miles inland, then generally you don't have to worry. You can grow these 20 miles inland. But up until that point, watch out. The mildew can totally mess up the crop. When the grapes get mildew, they usually split open and then they ferment before they ripen. And then you have a mess of wasps and bees going after them too. And that's the primary problem we have with grapes, is the mildew here. Occasionally we'll get caterpillars on them. Maybe I've seen them once in 40 or 50 years of growing them. There are some moths that fly in from distance. They're usually way inland, these big hawk moths that lay eggs on the vines. I saw them one year, and we had these really big orange hornworms on the grapevines. Grapes are fast growers, though. They usually outgrow any pest. You can use a spinosad product if you want to control any caterpillars without just picking them off. And Okay, so the main thing to know about grapes. So grapes are usually done on trellises. Now, again, you don't have to use a trellis. At the nursery, we grow a lot of grapes that we don't sell these normally. These are our plants that we test them just for their edibility and quality, and then we propagate new plants from the stems that grow on here. So we don't have to buy as many cuttings in to start them. So Dave Olson does this too. So Dave Olson, um, so we do this in the winter, sell them in the summer. Dave Olson does it in the winter too, and then they sell them to us in the fall. Um, so we've got these now to sell, whereas everything we grow every spring, we usually sell before the end of the year. Although we do have a few of our grapes left this year too. We grew enough. So we've gotten in 4 varieties from Dave Wilson. Now the grapes grow fruit on second year wood or wood that's a year old. So on a grape plant, you can kind of tell what grew this year because the bark on the stems is usually smoother. So you can see this smoother cane here, and then you've got the older parts of the plant that are real covered with this real rough flaky material, this rough flaky bark. You can see where they had a cluster of grapes here. A lot of the branches we've already cut off to get the size, keep the size small enough from our store. But now on these, what you need to do is you need to keep some of this branch. Now, again, both kiwi and grapes, if you don't trim it all, they'll still fruit. But the problem with grapes and kiwis both is they just are such tremendous growers that you'll be covering your entire garden with one plant after a few years. Grapes can grow branches 50 foot long. Well, you just don't want 50-foot branches. If you let this grape grow for about 3 years without pruning it, you'll have a couple hundred clusters of grapes to eat, but you'll be covering a quarter of an acre with one plant. So so you really don't need it to get that big to have a decent crop. So generally we choose the nicest stems. It's nice to choose a stem that doesn't have a cluster of grapes like this on it. They're a little stronger if they didn't make it. However, it's not essential. So whatever the nicest stems you have, like this stem here is a nice thick stem, grew this year. We want to leave about 2 to 3 foot of that. Even if you just leave a foot of it, you'll still get from each node on here, a branch will grow out with 1 or 2 clusters on it. So even a 1 foot piece of stem will have, that's already 5 or 6 clusters of grapes right there. And then you can have another stem like this one. Save this one, there's another 5 or 6 clusters of grapes. A skinny stem like this might make just a few clusters of grapes, but it still makes some. Now, commercially, they want the thicker stems because the thicker stems make the bigger clusters, which are more impressive commercially. For a homeowner, not, if all you have are thinner stems for spaced out, then save some of the thinner ones. You'll still get good grapes. They may not be store quality, but they'll be fine to eat. So generally we end up cutting off about 95% of the grapes, the stems that grew this year. And you can have an old structure that you leave around. I mean, there's no rules here. Your grape plant can be any shape you want. Commercially, each farm has their own way of pruning grapes and training grapes to make it easy. One of the ways they do a lot in orchards or vineyards nowadays is they'll have the ground down here, and then they'll have 3 or 4 levels of wires that are being supported by supports every 8 or 10 feet or longer. In vineyards, they use much thicker supports, and they can go farther distance between the supports. And then you'll have your grape, the permanent structure, you'll have it come up to the first wire and go both directions. And you can do this in the first year. Grapes are pretty fast growing. Now, if this grew this year, this can all flower and fruit next year, all over this whole structure. But in the years, what you'll do is you'll train the new growth to go up. Now, this is one of the newer methods. In the old days, they had the growth coming off these go sideways along the second wire or third wire, but they found out that if a grapevine has a support, it'll keep growing forever. It'll grow 20, 30 foot that direction. But what they found is if they grow it straight up across these wires and let it hang unsupported, if you go at about 5 or 6 foot off the top wire, the vine stops growing. It needs to find a support to keep growing. If it doesn't have the support, and I think plus it's hanging downwards, it just stops growing. So they don't have to do as much trimming if they let these things go straight up. And then you'll have your grapes forming off of these stems. And then they'll grow new stems that same year. So the next winter, you'll cut the nicest stems. If you have some that didn't have grapes on them, save those. So you can save a few feet of these. Cut these like so. And then they'll grow stems that have grapes on them. And you'll have more vines growing, and then you can also, again, thin these out during the year if they get too bushy. Save the ones you want for the next crop next year and do the same thing. In my own home, I used to train mine into an S shape. I don't know, I didn't like following the rules. But I've grown grapes in nature, they grow on trees. So I actually tried that. I grew my grape plant up the trunk of my apple tree, and there was apples and grapes on the same branches just hanging there. Grapes don't need full sun because they're used to growing on other plants. Vineyards usually grow them in full sun, though. You get your best crop that way, but they can certainly share space with other plants. I've grown them like a tree. So there are some wine grapes that are out there that are not so vigorous. They don't grow sideways very far, and there are some wine grapes that are trained like little trees with a single stake, and the branches are just allowed to go sideways. So the few grapes can be done that way, and I've done that too with just a single support. It can get a little messy looking in your yard if you're trying to grow things around it, though. I've grown them up a patio roof. I've grown them on wrought iron fences and on narrow trellises 3 foot wide. A 3 foot wide trellis, you can get 20, 30 clusters on that. So you don't have to let the grape grow huge to get a lot of grapes. They can do it in a pretty small area. Now, besides, so training-wise, again, second year growth, pretty easy to see. The varieties of grapes we just got in. So, of course, we sell mostly seedless. We just got in Suffolk Red. Suffolk Red is a hybrid grape. We were told that this is a Russian-American hybrid. It is a fairly large light red grape, not dark red like you see in the supermarkets, but light red grape. very, very sweet and seedless. Fairly mildew resistant, not as good as some of the black grapes, but still, um, our main plant on the support this year got a little bit of mildew on the interior, but not too much on the outside. So, and then another seedless one we just got is Interlaken. So European grapes are real subject to mildew, but they have the qualities that people like. European grapes, thin skin, tender skin, crispy flesh. That's the typical commercial supermarket grape. American grapes tend to have thick skin that doesn't get mildew, and they tend to have softer jelly-like flesh. So they're not. Some people don't like them as much, but both of these are hybrids with American grapes and things from Europe. Um, so they tend to be more mildew resistant than European grapes, less than American grapes, but they tend to be more crispy than American grapes. So Interlaken is it's a yellow grape. I wouldn't say it's the typical what it's called white or green grape, because this one is certainly more golden, and definitely has a nice sweet Chardonnay-like flavor to it. So the green grapes or yellow grapes tend to be more mildew prone than the red ones and the black ones, just so you know. So Interlaken this year was pretty bad with mildew. Now the other grape we've gotten in are seeded. And this year we got in Eastern Concord. This is just about purely American. We've heard that some of the genetic studies said there's a little European in it, but it's a black grape, or real dark blue black. Very little chance of getting mildew, but it does have seeds in it. When I was a kid, my dad grew these under his trellis, under a lath, and I was amazed. I didn't know you can grow grapes underneath that much shade, but apparently grapes can grow in almost total shade. I've done it several times now, but when I was a kid, I was amazed that they're growing underneath this last, not on top. So the seedless grapes like these two tend to ripen early summer. Concord ripens later summer. And we also got one wine grape in this year, Zinfandel. Now Zinfandel is pure European, but it is quite mildew resistant. It's one of the mildew resistant European grapes. I really haven't grown much in the way of wine grapes in the past, so I couldn't tell you. I know they ripen more in the fall. We usually train them. Most wine grapes, you cut the stems to a shorter length, between 1 and 3 nodes, to grow the wine. They want fewer clusters on wine grapes, and they usually also, when you grow wine grapes, you keep the water down to a little more of a minimum to keep them smaller. The smaller the grapes and the fewer the grapes, the more sugar they have in them. The higher the sugar content, put it that way. Whereas most table grapes, you want bigger grapes, juicier grapes. So we prune them a little bit smaller, otherwise, and then they take a little longer to ripen than these other grapes. Now, we have our best grape selection usually May, June, because we grow about 10 other varieties of grapes other than these. Now, we don't grow Concords and Zinfandel wine grapes, and if you want the wine grapes or the Concord grapes, then buy them this time of year. We can get a few more of these from Dave Wilson when our bare root season starts in January. So if you're interested in growing wine in your backyard, you can order the wine grapes from us. Usually they carry, let me just check the varieties that they usually carry. Cabernet is definitely one of them. Chardonnay. All right, where's their list of grapes? Here they are. Cabernet, Chardonnay, Colombard, French Colombard. I don't know how to pronounce this one. Gewürztraminer. Merlot, Pinot Noir, White Riesling, and Zinfandel. Usually grapes, no, for table grapes, ample water. Wine grapes, not as much. Generally in the ground, most grapes will grow pretty fast for 7 years without fertilizing them. So if they're growing 10, 15 foot a year, don't fertilize your grapes. If they're not growing that fast, go ahead and fertilize them. Primarily a nitrogen source. Regular fruit tree fertilizers are fine. But they don't, in containers, we have to fertilize them regularly, at least once a year in containers. But in the ground, they don't need much at all. Okay, yes.
So when it comes to fertilizing the grapes, does it matter if you fertilize them when they're fruiting? Do you have to fertilize them often, or does it matter?
Doesn't matter too much. They seem to be able to grow fast and make fruit at the same time. Um, I don't know. I would say, yeah, just fertilize them when they start to grow. I mean, you can kind of tell from the color of the leaves too. If the leaves are coming out real pale, they'll need some more fertilizer. Oh, that reminds me of another point. So when they're growing their branch and make grapes, um, they'll make clusters, say here, and they might grow 15, 20 foot longer than that. You don't have to keep all that growth. So when I first started doing this, I go, okay, how about leave about 4 or 5 foot after the grapes? Well, they actually checked that at the universities. They checked how much growth they need, and they say they need a minimum of 2 feet beyond the grape cluster. Because if you leave less than that, the grapes take all the energy, and this branch won't do well the next year. So they say at least 2 foot beyond the cluster of grapes. I like to go a little further, 3 or 4 feet beyond the cluster, and you can just cut it off and don't need all that massive plant that's potentially there. Any other questions? I think we've covered most of this to get you started. Um, so grapes, the size of the grapes much better in the ground than they are in pots, just so you know. So if they're in the ground, you water a lot, you'll get full-size grapes like at the supermarket. If you have them in containers, generally they tend to be smaller only because in a container it's hard to avoid the wet dry cycle. You water them if you water them once a day, they're wet, and by the time you get to the next day, they're dry unless you have a really big pot and a smaller plant, or unless you can water them several times a day to keep the soil moist, and then the grapes will reach full size. Now, it's interesting, in Japan, they specialize in growing huge grapes. And what they do in Japan, which is, we never do it here, is they'll cut off about 60% of the clusters that form. And on those clusters, they'll cut off half of that cluster so that the remaining grapes on the cluster, and sometimes they'll thin them out too, so that the remaining grapes get bigger. Of course, in Japan, they'll get like $10 a cluster at the market. So much more labor intensive to make bigger grapes if you want to do it. Um, um, we're satisfied with just having them taste good. Okay. Yes. I would say there's not really anything that's any different because most fruiting plants, with few exceptions, I mean, again, wine grapes, which are not things that people normally grow, they say you can grow them on 80% of what they need, they actually want. But that they said it's real hard for a homeowner to do that without having computers set up because you can kill a plant if you lower it too much. But generally, all plants like the ground to be wet a foot deep where the roots are. Um, I haven't really seen.
I'm thinking of water, for instance. You plant something, you know, like strawberries, almonds, water intensive.
Well, all plants, all crops are you can't let any crop go dry. And there are a lot of plants that survive a drought, but they won't fruit at that time. That's the thing. So, like a grape is a survivor. You can probably turn off the water for a year and it'll make it. Whereas some plants, citrus probably wouldn't survive that, although they might. But I don't know. If you want to grow a crop, you can't try to save water. It's really hard to do both. I know there's some crops where they'll tell you need to use. So they have a standard. I don't know what they use for the standard anymore. It used to be the standard evapotranspiration was a grass lawn, and most fruiting plants needed less than that, less than what a grass lawn would do. But there might be a few fruiting plants that use more than a grass lawn. But generally, if you have a lawn and you keep it green, you can grow any fruit tree in it. So yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, I'm sure the Farm Bureau or the University of California will have on their website somewhere uh, how this crop compares with another water-wise. I would think corn's supposed to be more efficient than most crops at using water. But still, corn, if you want a corn crop, you got to keep that thing really wet. I think they're just more efficient. They're not. It's not that they like less water. They're just more efficient in the calories they make per water used, something like that, because they can convert carbon dioxide and water to sugar at a better rate than most plants can. The grass plants can do that. So, okay, thank you.